Thank you. Dr. Luis Rivera is an associate professor of psychology at Rutgers University and the director of Rutgers' Implicit Social Cognition Lab. His experimental research investigates the implicit social cognitive processes underlying stereotyped attitudes and how these processes shape the self, identity, and health of stigmatized individuals. Dr. Rivera's research elucidates the contextual and motivational factors that shape individuals' stereotype-based cognition about themselves and others occurring outside of conscious awareness, control, and intention. His research has implications for the development and maintenance of stigmatized individuals' social identities, the expression of implicit and explicit, stereotyping and prejudice, and their relation to discriminatory behavior, and the presence and persistence of health disparities between members of socially advantaged and disadvantaged groups. He received his PhD in experimental social psychology at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Please help me welcome Dr. Luis.
Good evening. So it's been really fascinating to hear my colleagues speak about their different perspectives on racism. I kind of bring a little bit of a different perspective. As Elaine just mentioned, I'm a social psychologist, an experimental social psychologist. And the way we think about racism in social psychology and our approach to understanding racism is a little bit different from the way we think about structural racism. However, we also believe that understanding implicit bias at the individual level is important to understanding structural racism, because structural racism is tied to who we are as individuals, right? Because structural racism is made up by the individuals who are part of these institutions. So what I want to do is, in my 8 minutes, 7.5 minutes now, I want to tell you a little bit about this research on implicit bias. How many of you have heard of the term implicit bias? Not surprised from this crowd. I think I'm preaching mostly to the choir, but that's okay. So let me tell you a little bit about implicit bias. I think that to some extent, even with some of my colleagues in other fields, there's somewhat of a misunderstanding of what implicit bias is and where it comes from. So I hope to give us a little bit of an education as a way to set the stage for our discussion as a group around structural racism. So in order to understand really where implicit bias comes from, I'm actually going to give us an opportunity to engage in an activity. I like to do this activity with groups when I talk about implicit bias. So here's the activity, and I'm going to get the timer ready, please. Thank you. All right, so the activity is, I'm going to have all of you raise your hand in a moment. Not yet, but raise your hand in a moment. And the task is very simple. I'm going to show you a whole bunch of words that come in different colors. And your task is to simply name the color out loud. And it's a list of colors. So when you're done naming all of the colors, put your hand down. And the last person that puts his hand, or her, or they hand down, then we're going to stop the timer. Okay? So everyone put your hand up. Okay? The job is to name the color, not ignore the word, just name the color. Please. Go. Out loud.
Red, yellow, brown, black, green, yellow, purple, red, blue, orange.
Keep your hand up.
Green, yellow, brown, red, purple, blue, orange, green.
Put it down when you're done.
Oh, you gotta be fast.
All right. Good. What's the time on that?
18 seconds.
18 seconds. Good job. All right. Now that you've had practice, I'm going to give you a similar task. In fact, the same exact task. Again, your job is to name the color. Ignore the word. Just name the color out loud and put your hand down once you're done. Please put your hand up. Go. Color. Color. go to the timer to get a sense of what's happening here. When I gave you the previous slide, the color, the concept of color represented by what you saw visually, and the words, the semantics of the concept of color matched very strongly, right? So therefore, the first slide, you had no trouble naming the colors out loud as you read each row. But here we switched it up, right? We changed the color, what you saw visually, the color concept with the word, and now you had a lot of trouble with this task because of that switch. Well, this kind of gets to what we talk about in implicit bias, because implicit bias is comes from, at the most basic level, what we refer to as associations. Okay, so I'm gonna have to get used to this. Next, that's good, thank you. So at the most basic level, implicit biases are thoughts. They're thoughts that we have and what we formally talk about in social cognition as learned associations. But what's unique about these particular thoughts is that these are thoughts that individuals are not necessarily aware that they have them in their minds. And they're also thoughts that sometimes automatically pop up in our minds, meaning that we have no control over when the conditions under which they pop up in our minds, and sometimes they pop up fairly quickly. Now these thoughts, and some people already talked about this, are based on culture. They're not coming from thin air, they're coming from the culture and the environment in which we live in. And some of these thoughts are non-social. So for example, if I say peanut butter, you say jelly, right? At least most of us say jelly. I may say banana, but most people say jelly and associate that with peanut butter. But apple as well, yes. And then some thoughts are very social. So when in social psychology, when we do these nifty experiments and we show faces of black males, the automatic association that people have with black males is anything and everything related to criminality. And there's now many studies showing this, and this is an association that we really don't question anymore. What we really are questioning is, when is it that this association pops up in people's mind, and what does it mean for the bottom end of this process, which is the kinds of feelings that we have about the groups in which we associate different concepts with, and also the actions that we take when we are interacting with members of those groups. So in the research that I do and a whole bunch of my other colleagues do, one of the ways in which, in a very popular way in which these racial biases, these learned associations are measured, is using a task referred to as the IAT. And perhaps a lot of you have heard about the IAT. I usually don't talk about kind of like the method stuff that we do in crowds with community audiences, but I think you guys might appreciate seeing a little bit of a glimpse of how we do this in laboratory settings. So if you're a participant in our study, you will sit in front of a monitor that kind of looks like this, and then you will sit also in front of a keyboard, right? And you have these two keys, the A and the K key, that are colored with blue. And your task is fairly simple. It's kind of like the color task I showed you a moment ago. And your task is simply to look at the stimuli or the words or the pictures that appear in the center of the monitor, and then categorize those words and those pictures. So in this case, the concepts or the categories that are on the top left are pleasant or white, and on the top left, unpleasant or black. So as we roll through these stimuli, so you have the word birthday, that's usually associated with something pleasant, so you will click the K key. You see a white face, that's the category white, so you will click the K key, and you go on and on and on and perform these kinds of categorizations. Then around midway into this task, the categories pleasant or white and the categories unpleasant or black on the top right and top left are switched. So now you see pleasant or black on the right side and unpleasant or white on the left side. You will see the same stimuli, and again, your task is to simply categorize the stimuli according to the different categories of concepts on the top right and the top left. So similar to the color task that I gave you a moment ago, most people do a particular combination much faster relative to the other combination. And as you can possibly predict, can you go back please? Thank you. As you might predict, people do this task much faster when the categories pleasant and white are associated or paired on the monitor compared to pleasant or black. suggesting that in people's minds, they have these very strong associations about good and pleasant and white faces, kind of going back to what some of my colleagues were talking about, and versus black and pleasant. Now you might ask, well, so what? So what if someone does a task like this and they show this difference? Well, it turns out that doing a task like this and the quote-unquote implicit racial bias you show on a task like this means a lot for a host of domains and outcomes. So in general, one thing that I think is important to note is that often when people do a task like this, their implicit racial bias on a task like this actually is often contrary or contradicts what they tell us on a very traditional survey or questionnaire. So a person might say to me, for example, in our lab, yeah, I love black people. Yeah, I love Latinx and etc. But when they do a task like the one I just showed you, their implicit bias tends to be discrepant from what they're telling us on a survey and a questionnaire. The other thing that's really important to note about this research is that even folks like all of you in the audience who have these very egalitarian motives and intentions sometimes also show and display implicit bias. And we could talk a little bit more about that later on. So some of the research shows that children as young as 6 years of age show implicit bias on a task like that. And also in the domain of interpersonal interactions, like if you and I are having coffee at a cafe or a restaurant, implicit racial bias is related to my nonverbal behaviors, my verbal behaviors, how I allocate certain resources, and also to brain activity. There's a part of our brain called the amygdala that is well known to be the part of the brain that helps us to detect threats in our environment. Well, it turns out that that amygdala is very activated when people complete the task that I just showed you, suggesting that there's something about implicit bias that it serves to detect threats in our intergroup relationships in our social environments. Also, implicit racial bias seems to be better than explicit racial bias in explaining a lot of these interpersonal interactions. And finally, while a lot of the research has focused on black versus white faces, a lot of research in my lab and other labs are now showing that these implicit racial biases also target faces that represent Latinx, Hispanic folks, or people who come from Middle Eastern countries as well. Now, you might ask, what is the relationship between implicit biases at the individual level and structural racism? Well, as I kind of hinted already at the start, when implicit racial biases start to show up, or the individuals have these implicit racial biases and they're part of the institutions, these institutions are the sources of structural racism. So in other words, structural racism, which is a function of the racism within institutions, is also a function of the kinds of implicit biases that the individuals who are members of these institutions carry around. Now, you might ask, where's the evidence for that? Well, we actually are gathering a lot of interesting evidence showing that implicit bias is related to a lot of the kinds of manifestations of structural racism. So, for example, in schools, teachers' implicit racism is related to their anxiety when they're teaching kids from groups that are not part of their own groups. Also, their lesson quality as judged by objective judges, people who have no idea the levels of implicit bias that a teacher may have, that implicit racial bias is related to the lesson quality in the classroom. And last, and definitely not least, implicit racial bias is related to student performance as well. So you can see how the individual or the implicit racial bias that an individual may have can feed into racism within the institution, which then promotes and maintains structural racism as well. And then there are some other areas, please go to the next one as well. Thank you. There are 3 other areas in the employment industry, in the medical industry, the criminal justice system. In all of these areas, we see that implicit racial bias as measured by that task or a similar kind of task that I presented earlier is related to outcomes like hiring decisions, especially the leadership within that organization is kind of okay with a little bit of bias in the organization. That's where you tend to see that implicit racial bias is related to hiring decisions. In the medical domain, doctors and nurses exhibit implicit racial bias. And this is really important, right? Because doctors and nurses are trained to be culturally competent, to be very sensitive to different groups, because that is related to the quality of healthcare that they administer in those settings. Well, if doctors and nurses are also showing relatively strong levels of implicit racial bias, we need to think about what that means for cultural competency and other kinds of factors that are important in the interaction between doctors and nurses and patients. And then finally, and there's a lot more work that probably you see in the newspapers about this work around police, judges, and jurors, showing that across various outcomes, implicit racial bias appears to shape and influence things like the shooter bias. What is the shooter bias? The shooter bias is the idea, the notion that if someone pulls out a gun, a police officer, and is going to shoot someone else, a black man versus a white man, for example, they're more likely to make the mistake of shooting the black man because they think the black man is going to pull out a gun, when in reality is a wallet to show the police officer his or her driver's ID, a license ID. And then judges exhibit implicit racial bias. Jurors also exhibit implicit racial bias, especially if the evidence that they have in front of them is a little bit ambiguous. They rely on the implicit racial biases to make decisions about who's guilty and who's not guilty in that particular context. So in summary, what we have is a lot of studies showing that implicit racial bias is very pervasive in people's minds and their feelings and their actions. And this is linked, as I described previously, to structural racism, because the individuals are the institutions that we have around us. Those are made up by those individuals, which then shapes, again, structural racism. But all is not lost. All is not lost. I know that I've given you kind of a very sad story about the role of implicit racial bias in our communities and our minds, but there's a lot of good work that's starting to pop up showing that there are some really cool interventions, really cool ways to address implicit racial bias in institutions and in different settings. For example, what's happening tonight? What's happening tonight by you individuals, members of this community, getting together and talking about racism, talking about structural racism, talking about implicit bias, talking about how we got here, is one important way, is the first step to be able to overcome the potential role of implicit racial bias in shaping structural racism. But I will say that although these interventions at the more structural and institutional level are now being tested, the best way to overcome or to address implicit racial bias is at the individual level. In other words, knowing other people, and not just saying, hey, I know a black person, I know a gay person. That's pretty cool. I'm glad, I'm happy that you know a gay person and that you know a black person. That's great. But it's not just about that. It's about having what we call a high quality, strong quality relationship with multiple people from groups that you don't normally have that opportunity to interact with. People who have those kinds of experiences tend to show no or very low levels of implicit racial bias across all kinds of methods that we use in our studies. So that's a pretty good, that's actually really good news, right? That there is a way via our own experiences to deal with implicit racial bias. And there's some other ways to deal with it as well, which I will hold and reserve until our group discussion. Can I go over? Sorry about that. All right, thank you very much.